are recording the webinar. Everyone, though, is muted right now, so if you have a question or a comment, we'd ask that you go to the bottom of your screen, maybe, or perhaps there's a button at the top that says more, and click on the Q&A button. And if you click on that button, you can type in a question, and we'll not only be able to answer those questions during the webinar privately to you, but at the end of about 18 minutes, Jeff's going to go ahead and stop and pause for questions, and Johnny's going to moderate those questions. So if you have questions, as a reminder, type them into the Q&A box. So if you are interested in the future webinars, go to the same place you probably did to register for this one. We have 3 more lined up. If you're interested in giving a webinar, we're really open to people. We really want this just to be a community of learning. We're trying to just share amongst ourselves pretty informally, so we welcome ideas for other people to present as well, and maybe that will happen in the fall. So today I'm really pleased to welcome our speaker, Jeff Wasbes. He's going to be talking on cross-boundary insights, plans, critical incidents, and outcomes. We're so pleased to have Jeff. He's the Executive Deputy Director for Accountability at the SUNY Charter Schools Institute, and many of us know him as a skilled practitioner in monitoring and evaluation, really focusing on data-driven decision-making and management support. But specifically specializing in decision support systems that embrace complexity and focus on results. At the Institute, he's the chief data expert responsible for the design, production, and distribution of analyses related to charter school performance. So with that, I'm just going to go ahead and turn it right over to Jeff, who's going to speak for about 18 minutes, and then, like I said, we'll open it up for questions. So Jeff, take it away, and thank you so much for being here today.
Great, Danielle. Thanks very much. So, yeah, so I work here at the SUNY Charter Schools Institute, and if you don't have any background on this sort of thing, we tend to grant new charters to charter schools and then monitor and evaluate the performance of those schools. And then at regular intervals, we make recommendations to the SUNY trustees based on our evaluation about whether or not those schools should continue to operate. So schools and the policy environments in which they operate are combinatorial and dynamically complex systems. And during this webinar, I want to briefly discuss how the structure of a system determines the behavior of the system and why that's particularly important. I'm going to describe the difference between combinatorial complex systems and dynamically complex systems and talk about why that's important. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about computer simulation models and how they can help us to anticipate surprise and, if not plan for it, understand how to react to it with the greatest likelihood for effectiveness. So let me begin by discussing some concepts to understanding systems behavior that will sort of gird this conversation and that will also help us become more effective modelers. And I just want to say a word up front that when I talk about models in this particular case, I'm not talking about sort of statistical models that we might use to describe some behavior or try and make a sort of pinpoint prediction within certain error bounds about a value of some entity in the future. Instead, the models that I'm talking about today, these sorts of dynamic computer models, help us to understand how the structure of the system affects the behavior of that system over time and what the anticipated outcomes might be. So back to those concepts that are gonna sort of drive this type of modeling. Literally defined, endogenous means arising from within or having an internal cause or origin. So people who engage in system dynamics use this as their mantra, and they develop models that reflect this principle. System dynamics models are rich with feedback loops, and those feedback loops give rise to particular patterns of behavior. And the consequence of using this lens to view and interpret and design systems is a belief that in order to change the behavior of a system, one cannot do more or less of the same thing and expect a different result. Instead, oh, it looks like my font went a little wonky. I'm sorry about that. Instead, that is system dynamics oriented people believe that when you examine the system deeply enough to understand its structure, you can identify the leverage points, those places where making small changes to the structure have the greatest effect. If one can reveal these leverage points, then one can develop a strategy about how to change the structure of the system to achieve the desired results, kind of like complex systems judo. The goal, of course, is that one would be able to identify implementable solutions that have a higher probability of achieving meaningful impacts. So in changing the structure of the system, then, one would focus less on program activities or policy mechanics and focus more on the principles that guide the implementing organization's actions. Chris Argyris and Donald Schoen discovered exactly that in their work out of Harvard, that there's a difference between what they call single loop learning and double loop learning. They discovered that people could conceptualize problems and talk about them in ways that were very different than what they actually did to try and solve them. Most people could conceptualize some mental model about the structure of a system, but when faced with action, many would do more or less of the same action that was causing the problem in the first place, and they would expect a different result. Only very few would conceptualize the system and act to change its underlying structure to get a different result. And that sort of emphasizes or illustrates that difference between what they called single loop learning, which is doing more of the same and expecting a different result, and double loop learning, which is when you concentrate on that underlying structure or those underlying values. But with all my talk about identifying system structure, let me clear about something. Models don't need to be complex. Models need to be useful. Even the simplest mental model might not be the most useful one for the task. Might be the most useful one for the task. So for instance, baseball players. These guys and girls are really good at catching fly balls. Most of the time they're successful. While they're in the field, though, they don't measure the velocity with which the ball leaves the bat or its trajectory to determine the precise location where it'll land in the outfield. They use an error correction model where they track the motion of the ball and adjust their position. They close the gap between their observation of the ball's trajectory and the location of their glove until they track the ball right into the glove. Calculating all the physics is way too much. That's simply overkill. That mental model that they use, that simple mental model that adjusts for the error, the gap between the ball and the glove, that works just fine. Dynamic computer models need to be similarly useful. It doesn't do any good to model a system for the sake of modeling a system. Instead, you should endeavor to model a problem. So part of that process involves very purposeful decisions about identifying a model's boundaries, that is, which elements to include in the model and which elements to exclude. Not only is this important for the model's utility and its application to problem solving, but it's also really important for simplifying and communicating about complex ideas later on. Computer models also provide an inexpensive alternative to exploring existing ideas and for generating new ones. Because we work in social systems that involve real people in real life, we often don't have sufficient time or resource to figure out how a strategy will develop. So again, I apologize for the wonky fonts here, but I want to sort of demonstrate how simple it is to sort of think about this when you break it down. A system is really made up of only three things. It has elements, and those are the things that exist in a system. So these are the variables in the system, and they tend to always be nouns, right? These are things that exist in a certain state at a certain time. And elements link to each other through interconnections. And there's a set of simple rules that govern these interconnections. So for instance, an increase in one variable, or variable A, would lead to an increase or a decrease in variable B, to a value that's more or less than it would have been otherwise without that change in variable A. But there's a very simple set of rules, arithmetic or algebraic rules in these models that govern those interactions. And then finally, the third thing is a system has a function or a purpose. Again, apologizing for the wonky fonts where we seem to have lost our N. So anyways, examples of systems that can be modeled with just these three pieces include schools, right? So their function is to educate. model cities and the processes and interactions that happen within cities, and the function of a city you might identify as a place to live or work or recreate. Policies and programs are also systems, and for as many policies and programs that exist, there are an equal or greater number of defined functions. So if systems are made up of such simple things, then what causes them to become complex? Well, each element in a system contains information. Elements pass information between each other through interconnections. Elements and interconnections arrange in feedback loops. From the interactions between feedback loops arises some particular behavior over time, behavior that ideally fulfills the system's purpose or function. An example of a purpose might be to educate children, like I just talked about, or to provide the survival of one or several species. Complexity best describes the behavior that arises when the cause-effect relationships are subject to change and to constant change and adaptation. In social systems, the constant adaptation of cause-effect relationships is difficult to track because the changes often arise from the endogenous qualities of the system. That is, the things that cause the system to change and adapt arise from within the system itself. This type of feedback behavior is difficult to detect and even more difficult to predict or anticipate. Systems are definitely combinatorially complex. They often involve many variables with multiple interactions between them. But feedback behavior is dynamically complex. Dynamic complexity stems from changes in the levels and rates within the system and how the rest of the system responds to those changes over time. This type of behavior is not only difficult, but nearly impossible for human cognition alone to anticipate. We find it difficult to uncover the sources of policy resistance, for instance. We have a hard time anticipating some impending bifurcation, that is, when the state of a system suddenly changes dramatically. And for those reasons, we perceive complexity. So combinatorially complex things have lots of parts, but their behavior is fairly simple to understand and probably simple to anticipate. All the pieces combine in some linear fashion such that the outcomes can be known with some level of precision. Dynamic complexity arises from changes over time that, through the interactions of multiple elements and nonlinear interactions in the system, is difficult or impossible to predict with any level of precision. So can we even try to model this stuff? Well, I say yes. Models are simplified representations of real-world events. They support our limited cognition in navigating the complexity that arises from all of these dynamics, and the hard-to-predict behavior of the feedback mechanisms. And it's true that models come in lots of forms, from the most basic mental models to deeply sophisticated computer models and everything in between. The thing that defines the quality of a model, though, the quality of the results that it's able to produce and its utility. A roadmap is a model, right? It contains information relevant to a traveler navigating a complex transportation network. It's built within relevant boundaries. It includes information about direction, distance, and where routes intersect, but it excludes information about speed limits, traffic signals, and surrounding landmarks. The information contained in the roadmap, or the model, strips out the unnecessary information and makes the system navigable to our own limited cognition. It helps us to separate, in other words, the signal from the noise. So when we set out designing an evaluation or evaluating a policy or designing a policy even, we might look for examples of other types of these works that were successful under similar circumstances, either work of our own or work of others. And we might try to map out the logic of the program or policy and sort of reverse engineer the mechanisms of relatively successful ones to fit around the program or policy or whatever it is that we're trying to implement or design or evaluate. But in complex systems, these types of simple mechanisms don't drive outcomes. Cause and effect relationships are subject to constant change and adaptation. And other conditions exist in one environment that just cannot be recreated in another. So an evaluation or a policy may not be successful by simply hewing together elements from others as if there were some simple algorithm or equation that we could follow. So why are systems relevant to evaluation? Well, programs and policies, and these are, like I said, combinatorial and dynamically complex entities in their own right, are implemented into environments that are also complex. In many cases, the very action that we believe to be the solution of some problem is in fact exacerbating the very problem that we wish to solve. Remember that this issue of endogeneity. In most cases, without an understanding of how feedback-rich systems operate, evaluators and policy wonks are at risk of making actionable recommendations that are met with great resistance, or even worse, that generate unintended consequences. So models enable us to visualize not only the interactions within the system, even if the model is only a qualitative one, but also the behavior of the system if we can, in fact, can develop a full quantitative representation of our problem. These help us to anticipate unintended consequences and find leverage points in the system where, if we have the will and the means, we can make structural changes that will alter the behavior of the system. And in doing so, we hope to move the system's behavior closer to some desired outcome, or in other words, to solve a problem. So models also help us communicate about complexity in a way that enables us to tell a story. Just as we limit the scope of the model within a set of predefined boundaries, we also narrow the focus of our audience on those elements that are important to conveying the relevant information. So models help us find the right level of aggregation and to parse out that combinatorial complexity in favor of the dynamic complexity and the simple story that we really want to tell. So many systems are policy resistant, and by that I mean we can think of ways to solve a problem, implement a solution, and then suddenly nothing happens. Why? Because most social systems are generally stable. Once they find that happy place in equilibrium, it's really hard to change that behavior. And even if perturbed, most systems will find their way back to that comfortable equilibrium. There are people in every city who don't have a place to live. So governments and nonprofits supply shelter and housing. They estimate how much housing they need to shelter every homeless person and do their level best to provide an adequate supply. Yet, thousands of people go on living without homes. Why is that? So the process of developing a model forces us to think about the social processes and the social structure explicitly, and it draws out concrete applications from abstract concepts. There's also a very basic problem of measurement. Let me show you a little concept model to describe what I mean. So this little model that you see here shows an interaction between two stocks. There's an effort and there's an effect. And in general, this shows a balancing loop between the two. And what I mean by that is the more effort you put in, the more effect you will produce. Once you observe the increased effect, you can probably slack off a little bit on the effort. But once you do, the effect is going to diminish accordingly. So in this system, the amount of effort you put in is governed by the amount of effect that you deserve. So when you put in some good effort, you observe a greater effect. You see that increase, you stop putting in so much effort, and the system sort of oscillates around some desired level of some desired state of the system. So this is a little basic and abstract, I know, but it's going to serve the purpose for this example in terms of using, making my point here about using computer simulation models to anticipate surprise.
Hey everybody, this is Johnny. Let me just interject for a second. If people have questions,
so what this graph shows is the relationship between effort and effect over time, and this graph is this is the data that model on the previous slide produced. So you can see the pattern here. As the effort increases, the effect follows suit after just a short delay. And once we perceive that increased effect, our effort drops off, and the cycle continues on like that for some period of time. So if we look at just the effect over time, we can imagine that we have an evaluation or a study, some research study, that takes measures of that effect at a regular interval. So we'll take a baseline measure at time 0, and then take a measure at some regular time interval after that. So before I go on, I want to add a little disclaimer here. I'm going to treat the graph of this graph of the effect as if it were the true behavior of some system. I want to be very clear that I'm not advocating for using models to try and predict discrete values of some variable at a given point in time. Models can't do that. I would only advocate for using one of these dynamic models to understand patterns of behavior. So the usefulness of that is being able to anticipate some unwanted or unknown pattern, or anticipate some surprising behavior. But I'm not saying that we can predict discrete values here. But just for this exercise, let's imagine that the blue line shows some set of true values of behavior over time. And so we're going to take measures of those values at regular intervals. And we collect data. And we analyze it. And we draw some conclusion about the effectiveness of our efforts. And those conclusions are pretty far off from the actual behavior of the system. So the question here that I pose is, could some prior knowledge about the anticipated behavior of that system have caused us to make different decisions about how we measure this effect? I think maybe so. So I want to drive it simulation is doable. We are equipped with the tools to do it. We just need a little bit of practice. So there's software available, even free software, that's available for you to try this out if you haven't had experience with this type of stuff before. And you don't have to start from scratch. There are repositories of models that are available on the web. People have developed working models, and probably some of them hold kernels of a structure that you can use to get started. But like any new endeavor, you should probably consult with someone who has some experience and get a little guidance as you get started. But then we have to do things. So we have to find the entry points where we can introduce this type of design thinking into our work. And we need to know a little bit more about the roadblocks and barriers to successfully using modeling to enhance evaluation and policy practice in the real world.
Hey, this is Johnny.
So if you
have
questions,
asking
you haven't yet typed them into the Q&A box, I'm done with my spiel. And I'd be happy to entertain any thoughts, comments, or questions that you guys have. Thanks very much.
Well, this is Johnny here.
By the way, just to let everybody know, I am seeing no questions.
Yeah, this is Johnny here. Until people ask questions, I'll ask one. Have you actually used this to do what we would call an evaluation? Not just to describe a system, but actually used it as an evaluation tool or an evaluation methodology?
Which is wonderful. So I guess I must have been perfectly clear and explained all of those concepts exactly as they needed to be explained. So somebody asked, anonymous attendee asked, so can you give an example of how you use this in your work? So, the best example I think I can give of how I use this in my evaluation work, well, there's a couple of things. Internally in the office, this type of identifying dynamic behavior and anticipating effects is great for improving processes. So the evaluation work that we do here, there's a lot of moving pieces that go into these evaluations that for a lot of different schools. We authorize 147 different schools, so we have essentially 147 different evaluations going on at any given time. And so it's great for process improvement, for tracking the flow of some product, be it a report or some other analysis, through the different sort of divisions that exist in our office. So besides the evaluation unit, we have a legal and compliance division, we have a fiscal division, and all of those different parts have input on the final evaluation product to some degree or another. So it's great internally for process improvement. I also use this stuff more qualitatively while we are out doing visits to schools and collecting our the qualitative side of the evaluation data that we use. So that is to say, if we're breaking down the elements and how a school actually works and how that system produces strong results or weak results, if we identify some problem, we might sort of thumbnail sketch some of these types of things on the back of, on a notepad, to sort of explicitly get our ideas down on paper and understand the flow of information and the flow of resource between the different entities in running a school. And that really helps us to concretely identify where there might be hangups in the system, or where information may not be as pure as it should be, as a very sort of general example, without getting into specifics about any particular schools. I mentioned that, so another question, I mentioned that there was free software for this kind of modeling. Any examples? Yes, the best example that I could give is a product called Vensim. It's VENSIM, and the website is vensim.com. Ventana Systems produces this software for commercial use through a license. If you're using it for personal edification or academic use, they provide a free version, which is a little less powerful than the licensed version, but I will tell you that even the free version, your models can get pretty complex, pretty intricate, and pretty powerful with the tools that are afforded to you, even through the free version. Feel free, if you're having trouble tracking that one down, feel free to contact me and I can steer you in the right direction.
Hey Jeff, can you hear me? This is Danielle.
And that's it for the questions that I have at the moment. And it looks like we're almost up against our time, so I'm happy to stay on for as long as we need to answer any other questions. Oh, got one in right under the wire. If complex systems are inherently unpredictable because of emergence, and you seek to find leverage points to solve problems affect the system, you can't guarantee your inputs will have the desired effect. How do you think about this in terms of the goal of changing the system? So if I understand your question appropriately, it's true that you can't guarantee anything when we're talking about dynamic complexity, right? There are a lot of different factors, and the interactions are, as I mentioned, difficult to anticipate and impossible, I would say, to predict. So in terms of the goal of changing the system, I think what I'm advocating for here is a viewpoint that understands that taking more or less of a particular action is not likely to yield the results that you would anticipate. I think what I'm advocating for here is to not view interactions, not to view actions as producing, not to view a single course of action as being able to produce a desired result, but rather to examine the underlying values, the underlying tenets of an organization, and make sure that those types of values and tenets are aligned with the outcomes that you're seeking, and make sure that in considering courses of action, you've taken into account all of the environmental factors that might affect the outcomes. So I'm not sure that exactly answers your question, but I think your question sort of indicates a little bit of a misunderstanding about the relationship between inputs and the desired effects. So yeah, I hope that helps. I think until somebody cuts me off, I think we'll just go on with answering a couple of more of these questions. Can you say more about identifying the function of a system? Do you as an analyst identify it when beginning the model? And can you look at the model to see if the function is different than what you thought? What about different actors having different perceptions of what the function is supposed to be? That's a really great question, Eve. Thanks for asking it. So the function of a system, so the application of these models is really useful when you've identified a problem and you're looking to solve a problem. So like I said during the presentation, modeling a system for the sake of modeling a system isn't going to get you very far. Modeling a problem that's embedded in a complex system is going to get you far. So if you've identified some sort of a problem that a program or a policy is designed to address, that's the focus of the model. So when we talk about function, a policy or a program should function to address that problem. And then when you think about boundaries and what to include in the model and making that function or that purpose explicit, it's going to help to align different perceptions and make sure that the model and the policy and the program are all in alignment around that common function, and that those differences don't exist. So thanks again for the great question. I have a couple more here. So can you speak to considerations involved in identifying assumptions in a model of a dynamically complex system? So identifying assumptions goes to a couple of levels. On the macro level, well, let me say this. Yes, you should definitely identify assumptions when presenting results or structure of a model, or or talking about the problem itself. The assumptions in modeling goes to a couple of different areas that I'll address briefly because I know we're up against time. I said during the webinar that boundaries are important. Identifying the boundaries around your model and modeling the problem are really important. So that's the first set of assumptions. What am I going to include and what am I not going to include in my model to make it as effective and useful as possible? The other set of assumptions in these particular types of models, these system dynamics models, are about the interactions between the elements. So the elements, you've already decided what you're going to include, what you're not going to include, and then within the interactions, especially with the sort of softer variables, right, the human-oriented or not, the variables that aren't exactly easily quantified, you're going to have to make some assumptions there. And you're going to have to make some assumptions, A, not only about how they interact, but B, about the range of possible values that you might be able to come up with and the conditions under which those values will be realized. So yeah, so that's sort of two levels of identifying assumptions that you're going to need to address when either developing a model or communicating a model. Again, thanks for the great question.
Hey, Jeff, can you hear me?
Have stakeholders been involved in developing these dynamic models? Yes, absolutely. Some system dynamics folks like to interview and go to documents and then go back to their office, develop, and then come back and discuss the model with stakeholders. Other groups like to actually hold a group model building session where over a couple of days, a group of stakeholders might get together and provide direct input about the structure and outcomes of the model, and the model is sort of developed practically in real time, although not quite, and getting that sort of direct input or direct feedback from the stakeholders. Yes, absolutely, I advocate for stakeholder involvement. Whatever the preference of the modeler is fine, but stakeholders should absolutely be involved. And much like a logic model or other types of models, these types of dynamic models should definitely be sort of living entities that are subject to change and adaptation over time as information becomes available. Again, thanks for the great question. Okay, it seems that I can't hear Danielle or Johnny, and it's time to wrap up if there are no more questions. Seeing none, I'm going to thank you very much, and I guess hand it back to Danielle.
Okay, thank you so much, Jeff. I don't know if you can hear us or not, I'm not sure why, but I will say thanks to everyone for joining the call today. And Jeff, that was terrific. Hopefully if you listen to this recording, you'll know how much we were excited about your talk and actually really appreciated everything. So thank you everyone again, and we look forward to seeing you all back on the webinar in April. Thanks and have a great day.